Morning. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Assemble your coffee and your snacks. We brought out the A-level snack game.
It's needed on a Wednesday morning.
Okay. I want to welcome everybody to the Brookings Institution. I'm Norm Eisen. I'm a senior fellow here, and I'm the chair of our signature Brookings Governance Studies Anti-Corruption Program, ACDS, where it stands for Anti-Corruption, Democracy, and Security, where we explore the intersections of corruption as it represents a challenge to security and democracy, but also focus on real-world solutions, working with our friends all over the planet, including right here in the United States, to do that. We want to thank the BHP Foundation and the Open Society Foundations, among many other supporters of governance studies of Brookings and of ACDS for making the program and today possible. I'm so pleased that my friend Shannon Green, the assistant to the administrator at USAID and the head of the bureau, the new USAID Bureau, pretty new, USAID Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance at USAID. She was previously the director, executive director of the Anti-Corruption Task Force and a senior advisor to the administrator. And she has really led the elevation of anti-corruption as a cross-cutting priority at USAID. As a part of the implementation of the Biden administration's first ever release of a U.S. strategy on countering corruption, which is something those of us working in the field have been hoping for many, many years. Today marks the second anniversary of the release, and the strategy recognizes corruption as a critical and indeed as a central threat to American national security interests, those of our allies in the transatlantic relationship and globally, and to global democracy. So we thought that in recognition of the anniversary and of the new bureau at USAID, that we will take on the topic of tackling corruption to strengthen democracy and security, starting with our fireside chat. I don't see any fire. They should call it our mega screen chat. And then you'll meet colleagues. We'll have another set of conversations after this one. I want to acknowledge my colleague Jonathan Katz and Robin Lewis. They manage ACDS and do our anti-corruption work here at Brookings. And Jonathan will lead the second panel after Shannon and I chat. So I think that I have dispensed with all the niceties. We will not be offended. It is that time of day. If you get up and have a second cup of coffee or one of our famous Brookings scones or what have you, I may stroll over and get one just to set a good example. We'll chat a little bit, then we'll take questions from the audience and online. So, Shannon, thank you for all that you do. Thanks for being such a great colleague as Brookings, including as one of the civil society co-chairs, together with OGP, of the anti-corruption cohort, the FTI cohort of the Democracy Summit process, as we work with you all the time. Can you talk a little bit about the progress, in your view, that has been made in the Biden administration elevating the fight against corruption, and specifically, what are the additional steps that you've taken in your prior role and in your new role at USAID and your colleagues as well?
Yep. Well, thank you, Norm, for hosting me, and thanks to Brookings for putting together such a wonderful event to mark the 2-year anniversary and the build up towards COSP. About 2.5 years ago, as you noted, I came into the administration at a time when anti-corruption was really being elevated by the president, by the Secretary of State, and by USAID's administrator. And if I look back over the course of that 2.5 years, there are so many different things I could point to as signs of progress. But the first one I really want to highlight is just normalizing the conversation around corruption. And what I mean is previously, it just wasn't something that, like, as development practitioners and diplomats, we talked about regularly and openly. You know, some people did. It's not to say that, like, there weren't some intrepid ambassadors out there or USAID mission directors or regional bureau heads who were seized with the impact that corruption was having in the places that they were serving or in the sectors that they were concerned about. But it just wasn't something that people felt comfortable, you know, talking about and really putting on the front burner. In my mind, that has totally changed.
Why was that? Why didn't people center it? Was it because my experience as an ambassador, it's kind of ruffling feathers if you're providing aid and you say, oh, but I want to talk to you about you're crooked, your people are crooked in this country. Is that the problem?
It's a third rail issue. It's a very sensitive, very political issue, right? And our tendency is to not want to rock the boat when it comes to our bilateral relationships. And even within USAID, there were just so many other things that are, you know, easier to talk about, like our cooperation on vaccination campaigns, for example, or the support that we're providing to build capacity within X ministry. So it just wasn't something that I think people were encouraged to talk about, but that has totally shifted. And that is in some ways like the most important legacy, I think, of all of this. So now when I travel to Liberia, to DRC, to Zambia, colleagues going to Paraguay and elsewhere, it is something that the ambassador, the mission director, and people throughout the country team are regularly engaging their government counterparts on, and that is the sea change.
And do they get mad at you ever, Shannon, when you bring it up? Or is there ever any blowback from the partner countries or the individuals when you raise that?
Of course. But I think we try to raise it in a way that's, you know, really recognizes we all face corruption in our systems, like no question about it. So I think like we try to start from a place of like humility and talking about some of the deficiencies and the weaknesses. And that was one of the really profound things that the US strategy did 2 years ago. It said like, we, the US, are part of the problem. We have provided safe haven for these stolen funds and ill-gotten gains, and like we are going to do something about it. So I think number one, starting from a place of we're part of the problem, and now we're committing to be part of the solution. We have our own challenges, as do you. And pointing to, apropos of next week's events, you know, international commitments that these governments have made, and really, you know, talking about it as we want to help you fulfill the commitments that you have already made. And here are some very concrete ways that we're going to do so through our programming. So that's been another sea change, is like we've really been able to expand anti-corruption resources and programming. So we're not just saying like you need to do X, Y, and Z, but like we actually have money and programs that we can help bring to the table to support you in doing that.
Has that been a result of White House prioritization, OMB prioritization, and what about congressional? Has Congress also provided more money for? So it's been really
all of the above. Yep. And I would say like the Summit for Democracy process really gave us a platform to make that case, right? So the president said anti-corruption is one of the 3 pillars of this
Amazing.
process.
I never thought I'd see that.
I know, me too. So just marking it as like, this is one of the 3 pillars, and then we then had the opportunity to come forward with, okay, we have a lot of ideas for how we can make this pillar meaningful. The grand challenge on transnational corruption, for example, where USAID is really trying to innovate the way that we approach corruption. The Global Accountability Program, which is about capacity building for governments and providing that technical assistance so that they can tackle corruption within their systems. The support that we provided to investigative journalists to, unearth corruption and work across boundaries to put together these complex corruption cases. Like, all of these things were made possible by the White House's prioritization, which then became State Department's prioritization, USAID's prioritization, OMB's recognition, and then being able to wrap all of that within the Presidential Initiative for Democratic Renewal gave us the resources. And to be honest, like, it has been a relatively easy conversation to have with Congress, because there are a number of champions on the Hill from both sides of the aisle who have long been seized with the issue of corruption and have long seen how corruption undermines democracy, undermines the rule of law, inhibits, us being fully successful in various development sectors. So, like, all the stars aligned in a way that I think I've rarely seen on any issue set in my career to get us to that point.
And on this point of implementing that structure, and we're going to talk a little bit about programs like the STARE program, where you're providing support for global investigative journalism. I know in our role, managing as one of the co-leads for civil society of the FTI cohort, the anti-corruption cohort, in the Summit for Democracy process, we at ACDS looked at the existing commitments that you refer to. And it's so fascinating, and this is why next week is going to be, Shannon and I will be in Atlanta for the Conference of State Parties on UNCAC, and Brookings will be there, and our cohort will be there. But it's so interesting, the sheer number of commitments. When you're making the anti-corruption case to other countries or to the United States, the commitments are already there. And we've undertaken at ACDS a comprehensive catalog of all the commitments that the countries have made. But the implementation of the commitments, that's where I've been impressed with some of the specific steps that USAID has taken. So tell us about the specifics, the monies you've dedicated, the programs, and the implementation to, together with our allies, our partner country, our aid recipients, to implement on some of these commitments.
Yep. So you mentioned one of them, which is the Financial Transparency and Integrity Democracy Cohort. And Brookings and OGP have been such an instrumental part of that. The reason that's so important is because it's about providing best practices and technical assistance to the countries that want to fulfill their commitments, right? It's also about solidarity. So, like, translating commitments into real action inevitably is going to come up against some friction, right? And what we found time and time again is that local reformers who are really trying to drive progress on anti-corruption, they get blowback from within their system. They get blowback from people who benefit from the status quo. Having people that they can turn to from other countries with expertise and just solidarity is so important. So that's the first thing.
Can I just tell a little story? We were there for this. We weren't sure, as we were in the run-up to the Second Democracy Summit, we weren't sure what the international uptake would be. And Shannon and I, we had a prep session when we had IACC here co-sponsored by the United States and, of course, Transparency International. And we went to a room over in the Marriott Wardman Park, and it was packed with senior representatives of dozens of countries who were there to participate in this cohort, to talk about their commitments. And it was so inspiring for me to be in that room. because of the level of commitment. And of course, that is in response to the tone that President Biden, the United States government, the State Department, USAID, the administrator, and you have set, Shannon. So that is a remarkable, there's a desire to partner with us.
I think that's, okay, so that's the second thing, is we've been really intentional about surging support to countries that are serious about progress on the anti-corruption front. So USAID's Democracy Delivers initiative is really about trying to make investments in the places like Moldova or Zambia or Malawi that have said, we see corruption as like fundamentally undermining our own progress. And we are going to do the hard things to get, to make traction against this problem. And so we have been like, okay, we want to partner with you in that. So we've been surging support from USAID, from the private sector, from foundations into those places to help them, fulfill those reform commitments. And then the third thing I'll point to is USAID's own suite of programs. So I mentioned the Global Accountability Program. That one is fundamentally about channeling resources and technical support and capacity building into countries to help their governments fight transnational corruption in particular. So to sort of upgrade the tools that they have to fight transnational corruption, to work with other investigative bodies, to prosecute cases of corruption, to build their capacity internally to follow the money, to build the oversight bodies' capacity to monitor where the resources are going. So that's like another huge part of this suite of tools. And then the final thing is like just our own strategic messaging and support. So we try to lift up the examples of the countries that are doing the right things, tweeting about it, visiting them, just making sure that we're really showering them with attention so that there's an example of countries that are doing the right things and are benefiting from it in terms of international support.
And civil society is answering the call. We're so pleased with our new ACDS program. That is a place where civil society can gather, independent of the work that we're so honored to do as part of the cohort, to look at their commitments. And the beautiful part of that is that it's a partnership. We work with colleagues in government. So we have dozens of partners all over the world who are studying what are the commitments, what works, what doesn't work, how can we work together, that civil society government partnership. Also bringing business, they're a very important part of the table, and media. I just want you to describe very quickly for our friends the STARE program, because it's such a good example of the leverage. Then we'll touch on what we're going to do next week at COSP in Atlanta, and we'll open it up for questions from the audience and online. Tell us about STARE.
Well, first of all, civil society media are indispensable to the fight against corruption, full stop. And as much as we've been talking about support to governments, like the other side of the coin is the role that like the frontline actors play in fighting corruption, oftentimes at great personal risk. So I don't want to be like Pollyannish about the situation, right? Like when you are addressing corruption, you are coming up against people's interest, their money, their resources, their power, and that can be an extremely risky thing to do, right? So embedded in all of our programming and our outreach and our partnerships is a focus on addressing the threats that anti-corruption actors face. And that includes people in government, whistleblowers, the head of Supreme Audit institutions, prosecutor generals. So we have been thinking very much about protection as well as support. So STARE, also the EACCA, Empowering Anti-Corruption Change Agents, and other programs that USAID has been getting off the ground over the last 2.5 years, is really about helping investigative journalists and civil society unearth corruption and then work together to piece together these stories and then to work collectively to go after those who are engaged in corruption for accountability purposes, to change laws, regulations, et cetera, and like really see meaningful change. So civil society, the media, at the center of everything that we do. And we have to continue to provide that sort of umbrella of protection and solidarity if they are to continue their work.
One of the things that we've heard for years from civil society, and in particular from their media allies, is that in certain jurisdictions, particularly in London, lawsuits can be brought against those media figures around the world who expose corruption. It's really what you'd call in the United States a slap action. USAID, as part of the STARE program, is supporting Reporters Shield, which is basically an insurance risk pooling to defend reporters who encounter these challenges. So we're grateful. We're so grateful for that. Let me ask you quickly, because the time is flying as we knew it would. What are your goals for the Conference of State Parties on the UNCAC, the UN Convention Against Corruption, gathering in Atlanta next week?
Yep. Thank you for mentioning Reporter Shield. That is yet another tool in the toolkit. Again, really important to help reporters withstand those spurious lawsuits. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Okay, COSP next week. This goes back to the first part of our conversation, which is really about using COSP to drive meaningful progress and action for countries to fulfill the obligations that they have already made under UNCAC. So we are very much focused on closing the gap between commitments and implementation, and a lot of the sessions that the U.S. government will be leading is about getting further action and progress on issues around financial transparency and integrity, beneficial ownership registries, for example, and really trying, to make sure that we're all doing what we have committed to do so that the anti-corruption regime is much stronger. The other thing that we want to do is to highlight the importance of civil society, the private sector, and other entities in the fight against corruption. Conference of States Parties, that pretty much says it in the name that this is primarily about governments. But Norm, as you and I know, and we've been talking about for many years, we are not going to see progress on anti-corruption unless we are all coming together collectively, private sector, multilateral institutions, civil society, academic institutions, which are so rich in Atlanta, and really fighting the network of cartels and corrupt actors that have contributed to the explosion with our own network of equally empowered, passionate, robust, and resource actors. So those are two things that we really want to drive home in Atlanta: implementation, meaningful progress against commitments, and then just really needing to multilateralize and democratize the fight against corruption and the important role that so many different segments of society need to play.
At ACDS, one of our contributions to that, in addition to providing a networking function for governments, civil society, business, the press, is to catalog the commitments, and we'll be talking of over 100 countries made anti-corruption commitments as part of the Summit for Democracy process, and we'll be talking and having events next week about how it's going on those commitments. That commitment process is a tool that the anti-corruption champions within government can use to leverage change. So there was a need to help catalog. We're very honored to do that and track implementation. I'm going to come out to the audience now for questions. Looking at the clock, I have 5 of. There's a question up here, Catalina, and there's a question here. I'm going to take your short questions. Questions, not statements, please. I'll take these 2 questions together and we'll answer them then if we have time for another one. And there's one in the back of the room from my friend Matthew Murray as well. Yes, you were first.
Thank you very much, Norman. I have a question here regarding the program that you named as Democracy Delivers and any other programs that provide resources to these countries that have situation with corruption. It's a two-parted question. How do you navigate and leverage those resources in a way that doesn't make it appear to those countries that the more corruption they have, the more easy money out of the US they can get? And then also,
Consequences.
right, are you precluded from providing this type of assistance or resources if, let's say, that country already has sanctions imposed on the whole country or on specific corrupt officials?
Thank you so much. My name is Faraha Joy. I'm a Georgetown law student and also a Zimbabwean citizen. My question is, you mentioned support for journalists and support for civil society in general. In Zimbabwe, we've seen increased persecution of trade union leaders and who represent the masses. For example, they represent teachers, and teachers are suffering incredibly because of corruption. That is the core of their suffering. So I'd like to know if you provide any support for trade union leaders and considering the risks that they are facing as well. And then also whether Zimbabwe is one of the countries which has made any commitment to your project. If not, is there anything you can do to bring them on board? Thank you.
Okay, let's start with Democracy Delivers. How do you avoid perverse consequences of incentivizing corruption, and how you deal with sanctions, sanctioned countries?
Yep. So one of the novelties, I think, of the U.S. strategy is really providing us opportunities to come together across the entire U.S. government to address corruption. That has helped us see the big picture a bit more than we did before or could before. And what that does is try to make sure that we're channeling our resources and support to those places where there are meaningful windows of opportunity to address corruption, but also to give us a platform to think through how other investments in the places that are not committed to addressing corruption, might be unintentionally fueling corruption. So we've been really focused on this issue of safeguarding and having that broad strategic picture and just interrogating what we're doing and why, and trying to make sure that the investments and the engagement that we have in those countries, are not contributing to additional corruption. That's easier said than done, right? It's really difficult to get the entire U.S. government, together on any issue. It's also very difficult sometimes to weigh those various trade-offs. But I will say that part and parcel of a lot of these programs is this idea of putting resources in the places where we see that there is the potential for impact. Now, that doesn't mean not investing in some of the hard places, because in just about any country, you can find pockets of reformers. You can find opportunities, whether that's at the subnational level or working with parliament or working through other sectors. So I'm going to jump over to this point to make the point that when we think about anti-corruption, it's not just what we're doing with democracy, human rights, and governance resources. We have adopted this whole of agency strategy, which really means looking at our investments in global health, or looking at the way that we're doing humanitarian assistance and wanting to make sure that in all of those sectors, climate, et cetera, we are addressing corruption. So I'll give you an example from global health from Zambia, in fact, where there were concerns about leakages and diversion of health commodities within the government. And we used our global health money to work with the warehouses to tighten up the way that they were controlling those health commodities, and put all of these different controls in place to make sure that corrupt actors weren't able to sort of repurpose those health commodities. And that's just one example of how we're trying to leverage all of the other resources that USAID invest in various sectors in order to advance anti-corruption.
And I can say that as an observer, that supporting trade unions,
Yes.
they are a very important part of the big table: government, business, labor, civil society, media, very important part of the big table to advance anti-corruption progress, and in so doing, to strengthen democracy and security. And we see the nexus, whether it's the conflict, the Ukraine assault by Russia, the conflict triggered by the aggression of Hamas on October 7th, and the corruption that plays into those two conflicts that are so gripping the globe now. This is an essential issue if we are serious about democracy and security, and there's no one side that has a monopoly on it. One of the most telling remarks as we end our fireside chat is the United States has good reason to be humble if you look at the developments of recent years on anti-corruption, on the fragility of democracy and security, but also the hope. And as we at the ACDS program here at Brookings, Anti-Corruption, Democracy, and Security Program, as we look at the landscape, we're both daunted by the challenges, we're inspired by the commitments that have been made by over 100 countries on anti-corruption as part of the Summit for Democracy process, and of course very grateful to have colleagues and friends like Shannon, her bureau, new bureau at USAID, and the State Department, and the leadership from the US government on this anniversary. So thank you for being with us, Shannon. Sorry we didn't have time for more questions, but Matthew, you'll get the priority on the next panel. All right, thanks, friends. Appreciate having you with us, and I'm going to turn it over to John Katz now for panel number 2.
Thank you.
If everybody wants to get coffee right now, refresh their drinks or some food, please do so right now. It'd be great. Good timing to do it. Okay. Excellent. So I don't know how we can follow that last panel when we have Shannon Green and Ambassador Eisen both speaking, but I wanted to welcome our panelists, including Miranda joining from Sarajevo, and we'll do an introduction to the panelists. Minister, it's great to see you as well. Your ears may have been burning in that last panel because Moldova was one of the countries highlighted by Shannon Green and USAID as a country that is really advancing its anti-corruption agenda and deserves to be recognized for that work in an incredibly difficult time. So I wanted to start off just to say, my name is Jonathan Katz. I'm the Senior Director for the Anti-Corruption, Democracy, and Security Project, launching here today. It's so wonderful to be here. I want to welcome everyone. When I look out in this great crowd and those that are joining online, it's many of the colleagues that work with ACDS and have worked with Ambassador Eisen and Brookings over many years in the anti-corruption, democracy, and security space. So we want to welcome all of you that are joining online and here in person. thank you for being here. And I also, just for our panelists, thank you so much. This is when Norm mentioned in the last panel the ecosystem, and Shannon Green highlighted this too, of those that are needed to combat corruption, to advance transparency and accountability, to strengthen democracy and security. They were really pointing to you, to the work that you're doing in government, investigative journalism, Miranda, the work that OCCRP does, Sherry, the work that Accountability Lab is doing globally, and Andrew. CIPE has long been engaged in strengthening democracy and addressing corruption, and it was highlighting the important aspect and connection to private sector engagement. So what we're going to do here today is, all of you are incredible. I was talking to Miranda before the event today. When there's a fire, an anti-corruption fire, a democracy challenge, you guys run to the fire, and you don't duck these tough issues that were just outlined. But I wanted to do this, if I could, just to introduce everybody. Minister, I'll just start quickly with you. And we're going to, because we have such a short time here today, and of course so many questions from the audience that will be coming, but also some that came online already, we're going to dispense with full bios today. I know that may not be protocol, but we're going to do that. Minister Veronica Mihailov Moraro is the Minister of Justice for the Republic of Moldova. Thank you so much for coming here. I think you'll also be in Atlanta next week as well as part of a delegation here for COSP. We have Andrew Wilson, who is the Executive Director of the Center for International Private Enterprise at CIPE. Sherry Lee Erasmus, who's the co-CEO and Chief Learning and Agility Officer at Accountability Lab. And then we have Miranda Petrucic, who is in Sarajevo. I hope I said that right. Miranda, thank you so much for joining and for all the work that you guys are doing at OCCRP, so important. So if we can, I'm going to jump into some questions, and I wanted to maybe turn first to the minister, if I could. ACDS is, as Norm mentioned, is a project that will be focused on over the next several years. It's global in nature, but it's bringing together and focused on bringing together key stakeholders who are part of the anti-corruption ecosystem. And when I look out here, many of you you're part and parcel of that as well in different ways. Moldova has made tremendous progress in its anti-corruption fight. And I remember meeting with President Sandu, now President Sandu, when she was Minister of Education, and I was at USAID. And I remember her talking to us about what her vision was for Moldova. This was many years ago. And I think there was a lot of skepticism about the democratic changes that could occur, the effort to address and combat corruption. Think about it. In 2014, that was the year that $1 billion was stolen from banks in Moldova. There's been successive governments that have that made promises but didn't actually follow through on their commitments. Over the last couple of weeks, actually, there's been, I think, a real sign of that progress, including on your EU membership track. And when you look at the statements of the EU, the green light by the Commission, it still has to be decided by EU member states for membership. It really goes to these changes. And I wanted to talk to you because you've been one of the architects and one of the leads. I wanted to ask you, governments play such a central role. They can't do it alone. That's something in Moldova, having worked with Moldovan CSOs, journalists. They're vibrant. They're really amazing. But can you just tell us about where things stand in terms of the corruption, anti-corruption, and democracy commitments that are needed to get Moldova over the top, and you know, what has driven the reforms in Moldova, including in the middle of a conflict in your neighborhood, taking on Ukrainians, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians coming through Moldova, but yet you keep driving forward with these reforms. Can you talk to us about your government's efforts? And I think it's really important to highlight the successes, the challenges, and how we can strengthen that support for Moldova, the same support that Shannon Green spoke about in the big screen Fireside chat. So, Minister, over to you, and thank you so much again for being here.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me to thank you for the opportunity to join you today. Yes, you are right. Moldova has faced many challenges in its transition to a market economy and a pluralistic society. And it has suffered from political instabilities, economic stagnation, social unrest, and territorial disputes. It has been plagued by the widespread and systemic corruption, which unfortunately has eroded public confidence and hampered the development. Yes, the regional context, the threat to the stability of the state generated by the aggression against the neighbor country, the massive hybrid war in the Republic of Moldova made us to intensify the efforts to strengthen the democracy and security. Because there can now be democracy without ensuring security, and there is no respect of the human rights without democracy and security. When the President of the Republic of Moldova, Maia Sandu, took part in 2021 at the Summit for Democracy on the initiative of the United States President Joe Biden, she spoke about the fragility of democracy and solutions needed to strengthen it, including investment in people, elimination of corruption, and global solidarity that are essential for defending the values of a government that serves its citizens and for rebuilding the trust in the state. Yes, my government have placed the fight against corruption and the strengthening of accountable and independent justice system at the core of our transformation agenda on how to fortify our democracy. This means cleansing public institutions from vested interest and placing the national interest of the core of any government activity. It means making the government work for the people. It is precisely by making such tireless efforts that Moldova has shown many signs of progress and resilience, particularly since 2019. It has been undertaking since last year an extraordinary external vetting process to identify judges and prosecutors with integrity and ethics problems that are incompatible with continued service in those professions. It is also cooperated with international partners such as the European Union, the United States, and the United Nations to receive technical and financial assistance and to align to the legislation and standards with the EU and international norms. It is fitting that we are meeting today at the Brookings institution, which of course is one of the oldest and prestigious think tanks in the world. But it is also an organization that has been supporting Moldova's efforts for many years. I'd like to underline that just a few years ago, the Brookings Robert Bosch Foundation Transatlantic Initiative produced several reports and conducted events on Moldova, including on the geopolitical implications of Moldova's presidential election of 2020. The Brookings Institution has also collaborated with the think tanks and organizations in Moldova, such as the Expert Group and the Institute for European Policies and Reforms, which are valuable stakeholders and for our policymakers. But I would like to use most of my time today to discuss about the ongoing reform process that Moldovan government has embarked on for building a strong democracy and viable integrity mechanism. Despite many challenges, this reform is absolutely essential for our country. Significant initiatives have been promoted and others are still in development, including constitutional amendments which had fortified the role of judges' self-governing body, a reforming of the Supreme Court of Justice, an adjusted legal framework on the judges and prosecutors' accountability, fortified mechanism for human rights protection, fortifying the mechanism for selection and evaluating the performance of judges and prosecutors, and one of the most important of our reforms, the part, is the adoption of a framework for a special mechanism, external integrity assessment of judges and prosecutors, known also as a vetting. All these measures have been conceived towards ensuring the independence, transparency, and integrity of all the actors in the judiciary. Special attention is being paid to improving our state's capacities in fighting and eradicating corruption at all levels and in all sectors. Recently, amendments to the criminal procedure law have been introduced to facilitate prosecution, trial, and sentencing in absentia, a very necessary measure in Moldova because so many corrupt actors have found it convenient and too easy to flee the country. Improvements have been made to simplify criminal proceedings and special investigative measures. Although recently we have clearly delimited the competence of the anti-corruption prosecutors and the National Anti-Corruption Center regarding investigation of high-level corruption cases. Following ongoing consultation with the IMF recently on 24 November, new amendments were enacted widening the APO high official subjects. So we will continue our efforts to set up a functional and comprehensive asset recovery system also, which shall ensure a robust process starting from calculating the damage caused to the state. And last year, our parliament have approved the national plan for the recovery of criminal assets, and we are in the working process to elaborate a new concept about the mechanism of civil confiscation. Within the framework of the Summit for Democracy, Moldova has been leading a cohort of partners, countries, and civil society to advance international cooperation on asset recovery. And also I want to mention that we have engaged in a digitalization exercise of the justice system process to increase also the transparency. So Moldova is a country whose citizens have shown great courage and determination to express solidarity towards Ukrainian refugees and also to confront the threats to the security of our state and corruption, to pursue democratic change and European integration. It is a country that has made progress and achieved results, but also faces continued challenges and risks. So it is a country that needs the solidarity and assistance of the civil society and its European partners and also the United States. As a result of the ongoing reform of justice and the implementation of all the 9 conditionalities of the European Commission, recently on November 8, the Commission European recommended to open negotiation for accession to the EU of the Republic of Moldova. It is more than a big step on the long way becoming a full member of the European family. The Brookings institution has long been a partner and a friend of Moldova. It has contributed to advancement of new knowledge and understanding of Moldova's situation and potential. It is an institution that has offered important insights and solutions to the problems that Moldova faces and opportunities that are at hand. We in Moldova are very grateful for this support and for the one offered by the American people over the years towards the rule of law in the Republic of Moldova. And myself, I can be a personal example because as a young lawyer, intern, I was trained professionally due to the numerous American training programs, and then I also being involved in several consulting projects and strategic litigation in the field of human rights. So now I want that Moldovan people to become an example of functional justice in a safe country for every human being. This is just a brief overview of some of the ongoing reforms happening in Moldova. I hope that it might inspire some of you and to learn more or to get involved in this important and timely issue, and perhaps one day come to visit us in Moldova and see for yourselves what we are trying to do there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. That was incredible, and sort of laying out sort of what reforms have taken place to combat corruption, but also things that you're doing that are in place right now, and also the importance of the donor community, but the ecosystem, anti-corruption, democracy ecosystem within Moldova, which is absolutely critical. Can I ask you, what are the biggest threats to the progress that has been made that you see? And I think that's both internal and then external as well. And maybe just speak to that. Shannon mentioned the nature and the importance of combating transnational. Moldova has seen its share of that. In fact, it's been, in many ways, it's been on that front lines dealing both with challenges at home and also from external actors. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Thank you. Thank you for your questions. I think both. We have risks from internal country, but also external. When I mean about the internal risks, is about that signals of resistance against our reforms in the justice and anti-corruption fight, because there are still some actors who refuse to conform and to accept our reforms, because our extraordinary measures are quite very sharp for them, and they cannot accept that the situation cannot more go in the same field, the same way. And when it's about the external risks, it's about, of course, about the regional context, aggression and the treatment of Russia aggression to our neighbor countries, but also we have a big problem with a hybrid war, disinformation and the manipulation of mass media. So that's why we, in parallel, aside with the reform of justice, we are trying to implement the organization plan. It means a systemical approach with a lot of work for our institution. So we want to to fortify their capacities to prevent and to stop to react immediately when there is a treatment. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we'll certainly come back to that. And I find it disturbing, I think even last week, when you had certain Russian officials pointing to Moldova with additional threats. And I often tell people, well, that's been ongoing for quite some time. This isn't new. But the context of what's happening in the region, of course, is important, but to pay attention. And the stronger that Moldova's democracy is, the better ability it has to combat corruption, the stronger it will be to withstand these challenges externally. Andrew, I'm going to turn to you. CIPE has been on the front lines, including through its anti-corruption and governance sector work, working with the private sector to promote transparency and accountability. You know the U.S. strategy on countering corruption quite well, and have worked in Washington in this space with other partners, part of the democracy team along with NED, NDI, IRI, and so have sort of great admiration for the work that you and your colleagues have been doing globally. And we've just heard from the minister on this threat of corruption in Moldova, the challenges that it faces. I want to ask you about the private sector. And sort of how to think about strengthening that engagement with private sector to curb corruption. It was what I loved about what Shannon said too was, the U.S. is humble about its role in combating corruption, but also recognizing that this is one of the toughest issues, especially when you start to deal with interests within countries, which is something is always challenging, especially in spaces where governments are unwilling to actually implement they may pass legislation, but they won't implement laws. How should the approach be to private sector to incentivize engagement? Why is it important to have the private sector as part of the efforts to address this challenge? And of course, I'll ask you about UNCAC later, but I think this is really where CIPE has played a real role with other partners. ACDS, our new project, is going to be part of bringing together communities of learning, and specifically one focus on the private sector to help further one of the key actors in addressing this challenge, and maybe one at which has seemed to some to be less approachable or and a challenge to get involved, but has every reason to be interested in the type of activities that increase transparency and accountability. How do you what should be prioritized? How should we do it? I'm throwing a lot on your plate right now. So Andrew, I'm going to just send it over to you to answer this question.
Well, thanks, Jonathan. Let me start by congratulating you and your colleagues for setting up this center. I think it's wonderful that you're trying to, under one roof, bring so many folks together to have this discussion, and just seeing some of the familiar faces in the room here as well means that you're doing the right thing and you've got a lot of interest. I would say the Dream Team actually it expands here. We've been cooperating with OCCRP for instance, in the Gambia many years ago, where we provided support to some of their journalists who did some very heroic work on budget malfeasance, and we've been working with Accountability Lab on hackathons for better governance systems as well. And of course, our work with the private sector in Moldova really is predicated on you being successful, Madam Minister, in your work. If I may, I might get a little esoteric to start with and then get concrete on things, because I think the important observation to make here is that the operating environment for business, the incentive systems for business, have changed over the last 10, 20 years. And whereas I think when we first started looking at corruption as an issue, there was skepticism both of the private sector and within the private sector about taking on anti-corruption from a business perspective. And those incentives and those sort of environmental issues have really shaped a sea change in private sector attitudes towards corruption. And I think we also further have to break it down between, say, what a multinational might look at and what a local firm might look at. And even those relationships have evolved over the years to break, I think, give us some hope. So I'm going to have a little bit of red flag waving in terms of some of the challenges, but I also wanted to leave you with a sense that there's actually some room for optimism when we talk about private sector engagement, because the playing field is changing. The first thing is, let's start with our first assumption here is that competition and the ability to be competitive is a key driver in corporate decision making. And if we don't start with the incentives for bringing corporates along, we're going to have a tough time addressing corruption with the private sector moving forward. At the meta level, I think we have to recognize that the private sector is now operating in a business environment that is becoming increasingly fractured at a political and philosophical level. And it's a fracture that's occurring between, frankly, democratic states and authoritarian states. And it's capital flows from authoritarian states that can affect and shape the rule of law and the business environment in recipient states. We refer to this as corrosive capital. And essentially what corrosive capital is are what we see in a lot of terms of often state-directed investments, but perhaps crony-related investments coming from authoritarian states that enter local markets and kind of like water through cracks in the system, exploit existing weaknesses in the rule of law, exploit existing corrupt relationships and otherwise, and actually make governance and rule of law worse in those recipient states. If you're in a state-owned firm from one of these authoritarian states, it's to your benefit. You get to do work, and you get access to big donor-funded projects, authoritarian donor-funded projects. And otherwise, if you're in the local private sector, you're shut out of these opportunities. You don't get access to these types of projects, and we've seen examples from Sri Lanka and other big high-profile states where these capital flows have come in. But what we're seeing as a result of this is really an open competition. I wouldn't even call it competition, but an open conflict between two now competing economic and business/political models. One that reinforces corrupt states and corrupt leadership and provides them the capital and the cover to continue existing, and one which is a more traditional liberal democratic model on which most multinationals base their business activities, what we call maybe the liberal democratic model of investment. It's very difficult for what we would call constructive capital, those good investments, to enter those markets when they're in competition with corrosive capital markets. So multinational firms are now starting to see and understand that there's a link to democracy, governance, and rule of law that really can affect their ability to compete in emerging markets. So that's one thing that's changed over the years, and one thing I think both donors and states need to start grappling with in terms of how we build the incentive structure for good investment in markets. The second one, and I think this is more of a positive, is that the international rule of law has driven quite a few changes in terms of how companies assess risk, how they enter markets, and how they manage their supply chains. And one result of globalization over the years has really been the integration of small and medium-sized, more medium-sized local firms in emerging markets into global supply chains. And with that, the identification that they need to start upping their own game in terms of compliance and competitiveness and efficiencies and other things. So now what we're seeing as a result of things like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or some of the other standards that are emerging, that corporate behavior, changing corporate behavior has both incentives, we both got a carrot and a stick. So the stick really kind of hits the multinationals first. It's the FCPA, the UK Anti-Bribery Act. It's telling them if you don't comply, you're going to pay some hefty fines, and then you're going to have to demonstrate to us that you are putting in place better performance. On the other side of it, the incentive is for these companies is if they can get their acts together, they can join these supply chains and these value chains. So we're seeing a lot of uptake at the local level that's matching international firm commitments to compliance because there's this sort of unity of goals within supply chains. The big challenge we've got there is trying to help the local private sectors both find access to the information that they need to do this kind of work in internal compliance, but then also to help them find the courage to actually outwardly comply with these regulations. And that's where we need to look like things like collective action and otherwise, but also partnership with civil society so we can create that operating environment that Shannon was talking about in a rule of law environment that allows them to compete.
And I'll turn to Sherry too, sort of building on that. How do you do this? One of the questions we received online was about, one is in spaces where the incentives aren't high or the probability that the government is corrupt, the ecosystem isn't right. How do you, what can you do? And it was interesting that Shannon mentioned this, and sort of even from sort of USA days, how do you work in these spaces? How do you find the right way to invest? And I think I think for SIPE or Accountability Lab, and Sherry, I want to turn to you, and Andrew, I didn't mean to cut you off. If you, and I'll turn to Sherry next, is really how to work in some of those spaces too, because that corrosive investment finds its way there. And of course, it has a dramatic impact on populations, on youth, which will also, Sherry, I'm going to turn to you to talk a little bit about that, laying a heavy load on your plate as well. And of course, it just has a dramatic impact. And please finish up sort of your thoughts on this too. But I wanted to ask you about UNCAC and if you expect that from UNCAC that we're going to see this momentum. There's certainly been a lot of momentum in various aspects of the anti-corruption movement, efforts, civil society, media, which we'll get to Miranda too in just a bit. Maybe talk about some of the expectations and how do you how do you move both the needle forward on commitments, but actually, sort of get those implemented, what we might expect from the private sector. Even though this is a sort of government-focused event in Atlanta, it's not lost on us that there's a 2-day conference for private sector taking place during COSP. There's a civil society conference that's taking place, academic conference taking place. It just tells you how robust this ecosystem is, but it's got a long ways to go. So maybe I can turn it back to you. And then
Okay,
I'll
sure.
sharing.
I think the real challenge with things like UNCAC or the conference next week in Atlanta isn't so much in agreeing big principles and goals and linking them to both state and donor goals and et cetera. I think the real challenge there is trying to translate that into business speak and into business practice. And understanding that there's also a division, as I kind of alluded to earlier, between what a multinational can do and absorb and understand and implement versus what we can do at the local level. And I think if we're going to focus our efforts on these issues, we've got to be able to provide, I think, some solid guidance to both states and the private sector on the doables. What is the stuff that's achievable? And what is pie in the sky? Because often I think pie in the sky can just, frankly, if you can't comply with it, or the governance systems in a country can't actually enforce it, you often are just creating a space for more corruption to occur because people are going to find a workaround to unworkable solutions. So I think the focus needs to be, how do you translate goals into workable actions? And getting consensus around that, and then trying to identify what are some of the outcomes that we can measure, both from a private sector perspective, but I think from a state and civil society perspective on that.
Thank you, and ACDS will be part of that. Norm mentioned the measurement of commitments, and we'll be looking at that too in terms of the private sector as well. So we hope to certainly see progress. Sherry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I think what Andrew and the minister raised, I think, correlates with the work the Accountability Lab is doing globally, sort of your leadership in this area. And we're always happy to work with you and excited about various prospects. Of course, it was mentioned at the Summit for Democracy that one of the key pillars mentioned was combating corruption, but also the role of civil society. And I wanted to ask you about, sort of bringing back to Andrew's question about the work you're doing on the ground, incentivizing and engaging with civil society and the role of civil society. I think it's great to hear that there's been increased levels of funding to support democracy leaders and anti-corruption organizations. Can you talk a little bit about the Accountability Lab, about this space, but how are you working? And I think it was great to make this connection. We hope to be the connector. But you guys are already connected, doing work together on the ground. Talk about youth, and that has to be part of this network in combating corruption. And it struck me during the recent climate change conversations at COP, how that particular, that group, youth, next generation, is feeling in many ways either left out of the conversation or feeling unable to impact policy changes that will have a direct impact on their lives for the next generation. So we're going to, as ACDS, we're also thinking about this. The third Summit for Democracy in Seoul is going to focus on youth and technology. So I was very interested to ask you, of course, we hope that governments there, including the lead government, will focus on combating corruption as a key pillar. It's something that they've already mentioned in some of their early announcements, that it will be an important focus. How do we bridge these gaps? How do we create the ecosystem so that generations don't feel lost? And I'm sure, Minister, too, this is something thinking through in Moldova, which has experienced a number of challenges. This is an issue there as well. So, Sherry, can I turn it to you?
Thanks, Jonathan, and excellent questions, all very difficult questions, I will say. for us at Accountability Lab, it's really about how we create spaces that are enabling for young people and other marginalized groups and people who are more broadly often left out of governance conversations to really participate. So when we think about the COSP and multilateral initiatives like the Summit for Democracy, for us, it's really not about the commitments, because those are obviously needed and they're going to be made by governments, but how do we ultimately engage people who are adversely affected at the national and subnational level in holding governments accountable for these commitments that they're making. And so as civil society, I think we have a dual role to play here. Firstly, when we are in these global conversations, we have a responsibility to translate back what these commitments mean at the very tangible level for those affected by corruption in individual countries. And then secondly, I think there's a really important role to play in thinking creatively around how we build connective tissue between civil society actors and others so that we really create a jumping off point for collective action. And a big part of that is, in many ways, finding creative ways to get those who are excluded into these conversations. So you alluded to the fact that we have been working with our colleagues at CIPE, for example, and one such initiative is called Hack Corruption, where we are bringing together multi-talented groups of technologists, activists, people in the civil service, people in private sector, who are reimagining what anti-corruption tools in their space might look like, both at a local level, but also working at the transnational corruption level. And what this does is we're not just giving people tools and having the mentality of if they build it, they'll come, because that's quite simply not how this works. But what we're doing is we're creating deep buy-in into solving corruption challenges in uncommon ways at varying levels in society. And I think this is important for a number of reasons. Firstly, because yes, we do need to get young people excited about anti-corruption efforts, because they're not even the next generation. In most of the places where we work, they are the now generation. And so we simply cannot work together as civil society without engaging young people. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, in many of the spaces where we work, corruption has deeply eroded trust between civil society and government and the private sector. So it's really only through these multidimensional interventions where we create space for actors from these different sectors to work together that I think we can create deep buy-in for innovations that also rebuild trust, because they feel part of something ultimately that they're building in their country.
Yeah, thank you. And it's so critical to make those connections. I thank you. It is the now generation, and obviously they bring an incredible wealth of talent, but also for democracies, you need them to renew and to be part of that, and it's obviously challenging. I want to go to Miranda next, who's been waiting patiently in Sarajevo to talk to you and talk a little bit about, of course, our project is anti-corruption, democracy, and security, because corruption is a threat to democracy and security. And you and other investigative journalists have really been on the front lines of fighting corruption, as has been pointed out. Democratic backsliding has led to a decline in press freedom. And I wanted to ask you to speak to the challenges faced by investigative journalists, what are the biggest challenges right now that you see, and then also, what are the things, what are the tools that are needed to strengthen that work that's being done? And of course, you also work and engage with partners, including civil society, and maybe talk about how important that is to the work that you're doing. And of course, I think everybody here has read or seen something published or led by OCCRP, and also obviously the brave journalists who are working globally in the most challenging situations to uncover and expose. And then obviously the other part is, how do you hold accountable those individuals. And that's not necessarily the role of investigative journalists, but the people who are here today, this ecosystem, are listening because they are part of the solution to holding accountable the minister, strengthening rule of law and justice, transparency and accountability in government. Independent judiciaries are important. So Miranda, can I send it over to you to ask these big questions? And I think you have an audience here, and including a partner in ACDS who's real interested, including Ambassador Iser and others for years, in supporting the work of investigative journalists.
Thank you very much for having me. Good evening, and big congrats on the launch. I was very happy this spring to participate in the event of Brookings, which ultimately resulted in us getting the idea to launch a training program in Ukraine, because we believe any successful effort to rebuild Ukraine will need much greater transparency and, an army of journalists ready to investigate any wrongdoing or any sign of corruption. So thank you very much for being a great supporters of OCCRP, and thank you for having me. So talking about the challenges, to be honest, 10 years ago, there was a massive crackdown in Azerbaijan. I think this was one of my first, real life situation where I could see how democracy backslides. And, 10 years later, I cannot believe I'm again witnessing another crackdown. I think the biggest challenge is that governments are becoming much more blunt, much more open of the reasons why they're going after the media. Currently in Azerbaijan, they're targeting foreign-funded media, and they're very open about it. They're using, police and judicial apparatus to go after media. A positive side, I believe, 10 years ago, we had to gather a coalition of reporters to start reporting about Azerbaijan and exposing corruption, to show a message that you cannot really silence journalists. This time, within hours, we have gathered the coalition, and we will be working on another project exposing corruption in Azerbaijan as a result of crackdown. So I think media are becoming much more ready. We have built coalitions, we have built partnerships, and we can quickly actually respond to when our colleagues are in danger. I think Reporter Shield, it's probably one of the biggest developments that happened when it comes to SLAPP lawsuits. I'm very proud that my organization is part of that drive, and we see so many other organizations who are interested in the program and have applied, and I think that's going to be a real game changer when it comes to the SLAPP lawsuit. Of course, we continue to need legislative changes which would prevent SLAPP lawsuits in the first place. At the moment, OCCRP and our network is dealing with over 50 SLAPP lawsuits. And it's not really the question of us being able to defend ourselves. It's a question of resources and the time it takes from journalists to defend themselves. There are only several thousand investigative reporters in the world, and if you tie us in a frivolous lawsuit, we lose our precious time that we could actually use to investigate grand corruption and inform the work that you all guys are doing on the advocacy and activism side. And of course, what we're seeing is much bigger drive in the foreign agent laws. That has been an issue in my own country. We have one of the entities in my country has just adopted one, which again, I cannot believe has happened. So I think there's a lot more work that we need to all do to protect the gains that we had when it comes to media. I think this, situation in, one of the countries I'm very familiar with, Kyrgyzstan, it was the island of democracy in Central Asia. It's not that anymore. So it shows us really how quickly we can lose the gains and, how much stronger response we need. Because a challenge that I think the world has had is that, when countries backslide, we don't always have a very strong response it's kind of like you're good, but you're bad, but we'll still continue to deal with you. There's no real naming and shaming taking place, and this is something we can, do much better on. Hearing this conversation today was very heartwarming, because we have spent years uncovering grant corruption, and it is great to see when our exposés are something that is being used to actually drive a real change. And I think that's what's going on here. Journalists, unfortunately, though we would want to be part of the, policy making and advocating, we have to, stand on the side and just watch it happen. So when it happens, it's amazing to see. We do have a program which is called Global Anti-Corruption Consortium, which we've developed together with Transparency International, which is basically designed to make sure that our reporting effectively informs the work of wider anti-corruption field. And in a way, it's a handoff mechanism between our reporting and, civil society advocacy. This year alone, for example, we have done 3 major investigations looking into enablers. We've looked into Rothenberg brothers and how they have used an army of advisors and lawyers in Europe and US to help them shield their assets in the face of sanctions in 2014. We have done investigation into a Swiss wealth management firm and how they're catering to Russians and helping them shield their assets. And most recently, we've done investigation into Cyprus and how, Cyprus, not just the law firms, but also accounting firms have been used by, again, Russians to safeguard their assets in the face of sanctions. What is really cool to see is that, for example, TI, one of their advocacy goals and priorities is basically to look into how EU has a weak oversight system, which basically is enabling the enablers to actually continue to cater to types of clients that we see them catering to. I wanted to highlight the work that GAC has been doing on the enablers. This summer, GAC and gathered a small group of professionals who have gathered and discussed the issue. We've had the enablers workshop with multi-stakeholders discussing basically the ways, what are the challenges and, what is it that needs to be done in that field. And only this week, we have partnered with universities at Oxford and Exeter to use the data collected by OCCRP in the previous investigation to basically build a database of enablers and basically find the creative ways to actually do even more reporting and pattern recognition through use of artificial intelligence. So it's a really cool development. What we like to see is, in our stories, only 10% really of reporting that we do ends up published. So partnering with these kind of wide groups of researchers and experts really, allows that work to continue to live and inform the policy and informs the work of others. So that's exciting to see.
Marina, thank you, and thank you for pointing out the partnerships, and then also that it's a challenge, SLAP, in particular lawsuits, and how that impacts investigative journalists, and I think it is one of the top initiatives of USAID and Biden administration support of investigative journalists to do that. And of course, it's important that other partners and other donors in other countries are thinking about how they can also sort of impact that. We have only a few minutes left, and I just want to get in 2 quick questions if I can. So please raise your hand, and then we'll. And I apologize, as Norm did on the first round. There's too much to talk about and too many things, and each one of our speakers today could be an individual panel, given the areas that they focus on. But this is just a taste. So why don't we'll start right over here. I see a great colleague. And if you've already asked a question, I think we'll probably end up going to those that haven't been able to ask questions yet. Please just your name and who you represent.
Sure. Louise Russell Pravata with Open Ownership. Thanks to all of you for such a great and really interesting and wide-ranging panel. My question's really for you, Andrew. You mentioned collective action as a way to really sort of use business to drive anti-corruption reforms. I work on beneficial ownership transparency, and one thing we see and hear from the business community is, well, of course, we'll implement the regulations that are there. And even individuals within companies that are very sort of pro-anti-corruption and see the benefits, nobody really wants to stick their head above the parapet and do more to sort of advocate for strong reforms. So my question for you is really, does that resonate with your experience across other anti-corruption reforms too? If so, is it a problem, and what can we do about it? Thank you.
We'll take a couple of questions, and so why don't we go right back there. Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask the whole panel about Ukraine.
Can you just your name and
sorry. Peter Crispin, and as I said, I just want to ask the whole panel about Ukraine and what Zelensky's doing about anti-corruption. He seems to want to clamp down on corruption issues because they're trying to get into the Ukraine. They're trying to get into the EU. Sorry, I can't speak. They want to get into the EU. And I just want to ask the whole panel what they think about, compared to some other countries, what Zelensky's trying to do there.
Okay. And why don't we, I saw some hand raised, one over here.
Good morning. What a great panel. My name is Nee Simmons. I'm a resident fellow at Atlantic Council's Geotech Center. I run a initiative on this side outside of Atlantic Council. It's called the Diaspora Country Index. It's an index to rank African countries on how they're engaging their diasporas. My question to you is, what are some ways that you guys have thought about, or you maybe haven't thought about, of how can diasporas be used as a force multiplier to support accountability, transparency, and governance? It doesn't have to be really Africa. That's my question. Thank you.
Okay. So why don't we take those three, because I know we're unfortunately, I really do apologize. And maybe, Sherry, maybe on that last question too, sort of given the accountability lab's focus and engagement, might be able to respond to that question. And then Andrew on the first question, and then Minister, I'm not going to put you on the spot on Ukraine and Ukraine reforms. You're focused on Moldova's reforms, but maybe you want to speak to that sort of topic that our second questioner raised about reforms in the EU. And I'd be curious over the next couple of weeks what you're going to be focusing on to get Moldova over the top in the spaces of importance on these commitments that the EU laid out, that Moldova has been implementing, but still has some work to do. So, Sherry, I'll turn to you first for the last question. Answer the last question if you can.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question, Nee. I think engaging the diaspora has many benefits as it relates to being able to leverage skills, networks that have often flowed outside of a country, but where people can still really meaningfully contribute to strengthening governance within that country. So I think if one is able to engage the diaspora, people who want to make a positive difference, and if you can reach them with the right kind of messaging, I think there's definitely opportunities to use them. However, I do think that it's not an avenue that comes without challenges, because there's also various degrees of people wanting to be involved in the diaspora and different interests. So again, it's really important on civil society organizations, from my experience wanting to engage the diaspora, to be able to identify good actors and find ways to engage them positively, because the converse can also be true when we talk about the diaspora and governance.
Andrew?
Yeah, this is an interesting question on sort of how do you spur companies to enter it, because like Shannon was saying, there's always a lot of disincentives. In the case of a company, if you stick your head up when nobody else is sticking your head up, you could lose your business, right? Because there's going to be retribution. So collective action really is the preferred method. I think the secret to good collective action for the private sector is venue. who's going to lead it, right? So a business association or other type of collective group, a stock exchange, whatever group, an umbrella that they can form under, so they can have a degree of anonymity while still being able to discuss things in a legitimate forum is important, a business forum. And I think, too, the second part of that is to find local business champions who can act as sort of a demonstrator. So if they can see other companies doing well by doing the right thing, you're much more likely to have sort of a contagion effect, and other companies will start to participate. But that key piece to me is you need a business venue. Even coming into an anti-corruption venue is sometimes seen as a little risky for companies. If you can get an association or a stock exchange or somebody else to pick this up, that's where you'll see more traction.
Thank you. Minister, on the question, and I did want to ask you the Ukraine question because I think you're representing the Moldovan government, but your thoughts on just sort of responding to that, those last steps on the EU track and what you're prioritizing right now in that sprint over really the next week and a half plus, and how things look in that front.
Thank you for questions. So we are focused on all the 9 recommendations to the our engagement to the EU accession, but our main attention is focused on 3 recommendations, which is focused on to continue the progress on reform of justice, to fortify the anti-corruption institution, because we really need to have a stronger and resilient institution to be able to confront and to fight with corruption. Also because now the corruption is very complex, it's very developing, so our tools must be also prepared. And also we are very focused on also to extend the mutual assistance, the cooperation with other countries, because we have to be very well prepared regarding the money laundering crimes which extend our territorial. And also we want to finish with the implementation of the organization plans, because if our institution will be ready, will be fortified with enough tools, so that means we will be ready to limit any excessive influence of some oligarch in our social, economical, media lives.
Thank you, and I think we're all wishing you good luck in this next phase and watching closely what happens. I think we're slightly over time because I'm getting some looks from people in the back room, and it wasn't enough time to really go deeper into to all the issues that were both raised today, the challenges, things that I take away from this is the importance of this community at this moment working together. UNCAC will be an opportunity to advance this anti-corruption agenda at the global level. The importance of building out further beyond civil society and media, but private sector engagement, youth engagement, government cooperation, and countries meeting commitments and holding them accountable for anti-corruption commitments that have been made. So on behalf of Brookings ACDS, our newly launched project, thank you so much for being here for this launch, be part of this conversation. I suspect that each and every one of you, we hope, will be part of our community of learning and action. And so we look forward to the next opportunity to speak to you, Madam Minister. Thank you so much. Miranda, you've been patient online. Thank you so much to you and OCCRP. Sherry, thank you so much, and Andrew, and your colleagues at SIPE and others, many of the experts around this room from all the different sectors that are contributing. Thank you for all the work that you're doing. And I also want to just thank my Brookings colleagues, the events team, my colleagues that Norm already mentioned. These events don't happen without support from them. And I just want to thank each and every one of you for that support. So on behalf of Brookings, thank you again. Have a great rest of your day. To those online, we hope to see you again. And I'm so sorry that we weren't able to get to all of the questions, but I hope you will join me, those that are here and those online, in applauding our great speakers and experts on the front line of supporting democracy and security and combating corruption. Thank you so much. Thank you.